The morning sun had barely kissed the horizon when I saw her again, Claire Phillips, the HOA queen of entitlement, barreling across my farm in that oversized white SUV, blasting some pop music as if the cows, the creeks, and the century-old oak trees were cheering her on. I've lived here for decades, hand-patching every dirt road, fencing every boundary, planting every tree, but none of that seemed to matter to Claire. She drove like she owned the land, and worse, she smiled while doing it, like the world was hers to trample. The mud from the rainstorm yesterday still clung to the tracks, the evidence of her previous trespasses, and as I stepped outside with my coffee, I could feel the rage bubbling, not the blind, hasty kind but the slow, methodical fire that whispers, "This time you'll pay attention." I tried talking to her once, maybe twice, waving politely from my porch, but she waved back with that fake, sweet grin that always ends in insult. Letters from the HOA threatening consequences, if I didn't allow her shortcuts, had arrived in glossy envelopes, each one more absurd than the last, full of threats and official-looking stamps, but meaningless when weighed against decades-old deeds and property lines filed with the county. Derek Miller, my oldest friend and partner in small mischiefs, had laughed when I mentioned her. "Time to teach karma how to dig," he said, and that's when the idea took shape. 2 days of planning, sweat under the Texas sun, and precision digging later, we had our masterpiece. A trench perfectly concealed under a thin layer of dirt and plywood, exactly where her tires always hit at the wrong angle, invisible to the casual observer but deadly in its execution. Friday morning arrived, birds chirping, the creek whispering, and she came as predictable as sunrise, iced latte in hand, yoga mat tucked into the passenger seat, her body radiating confidence and entitlement. The SUV hit the hidden trap and sank into the mud like a stone thrown into a pond, tires spinning helplessly, the suspension groaning, dirt flying, airbag powder puffing through the windows, and Claire screamed, half in disbelief, half in rage. Derek and I couldn't breathe from laughter, and even the sheriff, who had arrived minutes later, walked the property line, confirming what I already knew. Every inch of this land was mine, legally and morally, and her letters, threats, and HOA status were meaningless against the law and the earth itself. She thrashed and fumed, calling everyone in her contact list, but the world had shifted for her in a trench made of patience, precision, and a little poetic justice. That moment, watching the so-called HOA queen struggle while my land remained unbroken, wasn't just satisfaction, it was a declaration. No one crosses this farm without consequences. And as the sun climbed higher, the mud settled, and the air filled with the faint smell of victory, I knew that this was only the beginning, the first chapter in a series of lessons for Claire Phillips that would span 7 unforgettable confrontations, each one more elaborate and satisfying than the last, leaving her fat ego bruised, her SUV humbled, and my farm's dignity untouchable. The day after Claire Phillips' SUV had sunk gloriously into my mud trench, word somehow spread through the HOA grapevine that I had dared to challenge their golden girl, and it felt like the neighborhood was holding its breath, half in shock, half in anticipation of her next tantrum. But I didn't wait for them. I knew Claire's kind too well. She'd escalate, she'd plot, she'd try to humiliate me publicly, and I had to be ready. That morning, the fog still hung low over the pasture, curling around the fence posts like silent witnesses, while I stood surveying the damage, smirking, enjoying the muddy tracks etched into my freshly tilled soil, and sipping strong black coffee that burned down my throat and fueled my plotting mind. Derek had already started building what we called Phase 2, a series of cleverly disguised ditches and decoy paths, each one calculated to misdirect, trap, or at least humiliate any driver daring enough to repeat Claire's audacious intrusion. By noon, the sun broke through, glinting off the puddles, and she appeared again, this time in a brand-new glossier SUV, her hair carefully curled, her face a mask of irritation turned forced charm, as if the mud fiasco had been someone else's fault. She attempted her usual arrogant wave, but I ignored it, letting her arrogance carry her right into a sequence we had engineered with near-surgical precision. A patch of loose, slippery mud bordered by hidden wooden planks that would collapse just enough to tilt her car into a shallow pit. The SUV teetered, then lurched forward like a drunken animal, Claire squealing, flailing her hands as Derek and I watched from the farmhouse porch, trying to keep straight faces while the tires spun in vain. But the real twist came when, mid-struggle, she attempted to reverse, only to find the ground behind her had been deliberately soft, a trap we had created earlier, and her car slid sideways, scraping against the newly planted saplings I had been nurturing for years, their roots clawing at the tires as if nature itself was punishing her. She shouted, her voice cracking as adrenaline and fury collided, calling neighbors, recording videos for social media, threatening lawsuits that she couldn't possibly file, all while Derek and I, hidden in the tall grass nearby, documented everything with our phones, planning to share the absurdity of her arrogance with anyone who would laugh. Hours passed, the sun dipped low, and Claire finally abandoned the SUV, stomped across the field in her designer boots, and glared at me with a mix of disbelief, rage, and a desperate desire to regain control, but every inch of her expression told me one thing: the farm had won. And that night, as I locked up the barn and watched the stars emerge over my land, I realized that Phase 2 wasn't just about punishing her, it was about teaching her, step by meticulous step, that entitlement has limits, that greed has consequences, and that sometimes the simplest tools, a trench, some mud, a bit of cunning, are more powerful than any HOA letter, lawyer, or lecture. It was a long day of victories hidden in laughter and subtle humiliation, a day that promised the coming weeks would be even more elaborate, more humiliating, and more satisfying, each plan an escalating masterpiece, a story waiting to unfold, leaving Claire's ego battered, her confidence shaken, and my farm more secure, more respected, and undeniably mine. The morning sun had barely started to climb over the ridge when I stepped onto my property, the dew-soaked grass crunching under my boots and the smell of freshly turned earth still heavy in the air from the trench we had dug days before. The world felt unusually still, like nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation, and for a brief moment I allowed myself a tiny smile of satisfaction at the thought of what was about to unfold. The fence lines glistened faintly with morning frost, the cattle wandered lazily across the fields, and in the distance, the long, winding dirt road that Claire Phillips had so arrogantly driven across all these months lay silent, biding its time, a perfect stage set for justice. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, the bitter steam curling up into the cold air, and leaned against the weathered post, watching for any sign of movement from the HOA side of the creek. Derek Miller arrived shortly after, already whistling a low, mischievous tune, donuts in hand, the grin on his face betraying that he had been waiting all week for this moment just as eagerly as I had. "You think she's coming early?" I asked, and he shook his head with a chuckle. "Nah, she likes her dramatic entrance. It wouldn't be the same if she showed up on time." We settled into our concealed positions behind the hay bales, cameras hidden in the brush catching every angle, the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass the only thing breaking the silence. The minutes dragged by, each second stretching out in that tense anticipation that only comes when you know something monumental is about to occur. Then, far down the ridge, we heard it, the unmistakable growl of a white SUV, tires crunching against gravel, a familiar smell of gasoline and arrogance hitting the senses before even a glimpse of the vehicle appeared. "Here she comes," Derek whispered, eyes gleaming. And there she was, Claire Phillips, queen of her imaginary kingdom, larger than life both in presence and ego, SUV gleaming under the morning sun, yoga mat sticking out of the passenger seat, pink blazer now replaced with a flashy windbreaker adorned with the HOA logo, oversized sunglasses hiding half her smug face, and the unmistakable iced latte wobbling precariously in the cup holder. Her voice carried across the field even before the vehicle did, a mix of self-affirmation and entitlement, shouting into her phone about community harmony, boundaries, and civic responsibility, as if the universe itself had aligned to broadcast her arrogance in surround sound. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the moment, while Derek adjusted the camera, muttering, "She really thinks she's the center of the world." As the SUV approached the bend, she didn't slow down a bit, her tires rolling straight over the disguised plywood covering our perfectly camouflaged trench. Crack. The sound ripped through the morning air like a cannon, the front tires plunging into the hollow, the suspension groaning under the sudden drop, and in an instant the SUV was wedged perfectly, the front end submerged, back tires flailing helplessly as if begging for mercy. Claire's shriek tore through the field, a high-pitched, wailing sound somewhere between terror and indignation, as she slammed her hands on the dashboard, her latte spilling and soaking the upholstery, the scent of coffee mingling with dust and tire smoke in a chaotic perfume of poetic justice. Derek and I doubled over, trying not to laugh as the mechanical chaos unfolded in front of us, the world momentarily reduced to her flailing SUV and her. The morning after the trench incident, the farm had that eerie, victorious calm that only follows a small war one, the sun climbing lazily over the horizon as mist rolled across the fields, and I stood on the porch with a thermos of coffee, binoculars in hand, scanning the distant treeline for any sign of movement from the HOA camp, knowing full well that Claire Phillips would not let a humiliation of that magnitude go unanswered. Derek arrived shortly after, his usual grin smeared with sleep and excitement, holding a blueprint of the land, annotated meticulously with every previous trespass, every tire mark, and every inch of the mud-covered trench, like a general preparing for a strategic strike in a battle that had just begun. "She's not going to forget yesterday," he said, eyes glinting. I nodded, knowing full well that her arrogance and sheer fat entitlement would fuel a series of increasingly desperate maneuvers. The first sign of her approach was the distant drone hum, a mechanical buzz slicing through the morning air, followed by a flurry of activity at the far edge of the property where her massive SUV had been rescued. I recognized the signature pink windbreaker, now smeared with dried mud, and the unmistakable bulk of Claire herself striding with the confidence of someone convinced the world owed her obedience. She had brought reinforcements this time, 2 oversized SUVs, a mini bulldozer, and what appeared to be half of the HOA board carrying clipboards, cameras, and more entitlement than physics could reasonably accommodate. Their march across the fields was comically methodical, each step crunching the frost, and I couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity. Here was a parade of fat arrogance charging into a land that had already proven itself inhospitable to their ego. Derek and I hunkered behind the hay bales again, cameras set up, recording angles, and I felt that familiar rush, the intoxicating thrill of watching justice unfold slowly but inexorably, the sun now climbing higher, casting long golden shafts across the glistening trench that had once imprisoned her SUV. As they neared, Claire shouted orders, waving her oversized arms, directing the mini bulldozer like she was orchestrating a symphony of destruction, every command punctuated with her shrill voice, now muddied with determination, panic, and pure ego. The bulldozer groaned as it rumbled forward, its metal claw scraping the frozen earth, leaving deep, furrowed tracks that gleamed like scars under the morning light, and my heart raced with anticipation because I had prepared for this exact moment. The trench had been reinforced overnight, expanded and deepened subtly with hidden stakes, mud pits, and cleverly placed boards designed to make any large vehicle attempt impossible without consequence. Claire's SUV attempted to lead the charge, fat frame bouncing with every wheel spin, but the ground shifted like it knew, the earth conspiring against her, tires sinking and skidding, sending her sprawling forward in a cloud of mud and shredded dignity. Her companions shouted, flailing, trying to stabilize the vehicle, but the moment they tried to push forward, the mini bulldozer clattered into a concealed mud pit I had widened silently overnight, groaning as metal met the soft earth, tilting dangerously, trapping 2 more vehicles and ensuring that the HOA's parade of arrogance was rendered immobile in spectacular fashion. Claire's shriek pierced the air, louder and more theatrical than the day before, as she attempted to extricate herself from her SUV, slipping, sliding, and finally plopping into the mud like a cartoonish cannonball, Lotte floating forlornly in the mud puddle beside her, pink windbreaker soaked and clinging, hair plastered to her sweat-streaked face. Derek and I couldn't contain our laughter this time. The scene was almost too perfect, a symphony of chaos orchestrated by months of patience and preparation, the earth itself siding with reason and justice against entitlement. Cameras caught every second, every groan of metal, every scream of fat panic, the rising sun painting everything in gold, like some twisted, cinematic triumph of cleverness over audacity. Sheriff Cole arrived again, calm, measured, taking in the absurdity with that same look that said he had seen too many petty HOA battles but had never witnessed anything this theatrically catastrophic. Claire immediately launched into her tirade, pointing fingers, waving her arms, and flailing in mud that clung to her like some grotesque costume, demanding immediate intervention, legal action, and a full-scale rescue operation. Cole gestured toward the trench and mud pits, sighing, and calmly explained that without proper easements, legal right-of-way, or approval for any construction on my land, her actions were trespassing, reckless endangerment, and in some cases damage to property that she did not own. Claire's massive form collapsed in disbelief, mud sliding down her cheeks, Lotte soggy and forgotten, while the tow operators and bulldozer drivers muttered under their breath and attempted to recover vehicles that were, for all practical purposes, stuck, immobile, and fully under the control of gravity, mud, and my precise planning. I watched, coffee in hand, as Derek whispered, "She seriously thinks she can bully the land into submission," and I nodded, eyes narrowing, imagining the sequence of letters, fines, calls, and social media posts that would follow, all futile against the undeniable reality of law and strategy. Claire attempted one last maneuver, climbing atop her SUV, shouting into the wind, calling every lawyer, realtor, and HOA executive she could think of, but the world had already flipped against her, her colossal ego drenched in mud, every movement amplified by her fat presence, exaggerated, almost cartoonish in its absurdity. By mid-afternoon, she had finally been subdued into temporary compliance, Sheriff Cole issuing official warnings, tow operators arranging safe extraction, and the scene slowly settling into a tableau of chaos, mud, and triumph. Claire herself was perched on the edge of the trench, windbreaker tattered, hair plastered, Latte a cold, brown puddle, her fat arms folded in frustration and disbelief, glaring daggers at me over the distance like a defeated general unwilling to accept surrender. I allowed myself a slow smile, knowing that this section of the war had been decisively won, but also aware that Claire's audacity would continue, that her pride and entitlement were indomitable forces that required strategy, patience, and occasional theatrical mud-trap interventions. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the farm in golden red, trench gleaming faintly like a scar of justice, and I felt that familiar satisfaction, the intoxicating sense of principle meeting persistence, of planning executing flawlessly, of nature and law aligning against arrogance and entitlement. Derek clapped me on the shoulder, muttering, "This is going to be legendary on the videos," and I nodded, envisioning the montage of screams, mud, flailing, SUV carnage, fat chaos, and inevitable social media virality, knowing that this chapter would be remembered in the annals of HOA madness as the day entitlement met the earth and lost spectacularly. As darkness approached, Claire was finally escorted off the property, fat form wobbling, windbreaker caked with mud, hair still plastered, SUV immobilized, and her entourage flustered, exhausted, defeated, leaving the farm in a quiet, victorious hush that only those who have orchestrated such theatrical justice can truly savor. I leaned back against the porch rail, coffee cooling in hand, boomer at my feet, and watched the sun disappear, knowing that while this battle had ended, the war with entitlement, bureaucracy, and fat HOA power had only just begun, and the farm, the trench, and my meticulous planning would continue to defend the land with relentless, cinematic, and poetic precision, every inch a testament to patience, strategy, and the sweet satisfaction of watching the absurdity of arrogance crumble under the weight of well-laid plans and nature's quiet, yet undeniable, support. The night after the trench disaster, the farm was bathed in an almost surreal calm, moonlight streaming across the fields like a silver spotlight, illuminating every furrow of mud, every tire scar, and the deep, victorious trench that had rendered the fat, entitled HOA President Claire Phillips and her entourage helpless the day before. I paced the porch with binoculars and a notebook, jotting down every possible weak point, every potential path of revenge or retaliation they might consider. Because one thing was certain, Karen would not accept defeat quietly, and the law of inertia applied as much to arrogance as to physics. Derek joined me, holding a thermos of coffee and a digital map filled with layers of property boundaries, mud traps and escape routes, his grin wide and almost conspiratorial, knowing that last night's spectacle would be only the first in a long series of humiliations, and that Claire's fat, obstinate presence guaranteed we had theater for days. "She'll be back," Derek said, eyes scanning the dark horizon, his tone calm but edged with excitement. "And she'll bring everything she owns, thinking brute force will fix what brains failed at yesterday." I nodded, mentally preparing the farm for the inevitable siege, having spent hours plotting subtle reinforcements. Hidden trenches, strategically placed mud pits, reinforced boards to trap vehicles, and most importantly psychological warfare, because nothing terrifies a fat, entitled HOA president more than seeing her own plans collapse in real time. By dawn, the distant hum of engines announced her arrival, this time with even more vehicles, including a borrowed delivery truck, a clunky construction van, and a gaggle of HOA board members, all wearing matching pink windbreakers in a display of solidarity, arrogance, and complete ignorance of their impending humiliation. Claire herself stood atop her massive SUV, megaphone in hand, shouting commands and insults simultaneously, her fat arms waving dramatically, shouting for anyone who could hear her that she owned the land, the air, and even the clouds above it, while my strategically placed cameras recorded every ridiculous gesture for posterity. Derek and I crouched behind the reinforced hay bales, hearts pounding with excitement, as the first vehicle attempted to cross the field where yesterday's trench had left an indelible mark. The mud, frozen overnight and then thawed by morning sun, was now even stickier, deeper, and more treacherous, perfectly engineered to punish overconfidence. The SUV's wheels spun helplessly, flinging mud into the air, covering Claire's pink windbreaker, her hair plastered to her sweat-streaked face, latte long forgotten in the previous disaster now replaced by her own desperate flailing. The mini bulldozer followed, struggling across a cleverly deepened trench I had expanded overnight, groaning as metal met soft earth, tilting alarmingly, almost toppling onto the SUV's hood, and Claire screamed for someone to pull it back, her fat form wobbling dangerously atop the sinking SUV. Her entourage scrambled, trying to stabilize vehicles, but every attempt only led to more chaos. One SUV tipped sideways, wedging its fat frame into the mud, another got caught in the trench I had expanded, the construction van slid uncontrollably, smashing a fence post with a deafening crack, and every movement of the fat, entitled HOA members became a choreography of panic and disaster, perfectly orchestrated by careful planning and the unforgiving law of gravity. Claire, realizing brute force was failing, attempted to intimidate us by shouting threats, calling lawyers, recording videos for social media, and even trying to summon local authorities, but the farm had already rewritten the rules. Every inch was a trap, every mud pit a lesson, and every sunbeam reflected her folly. By mid-morning the scene resembled a battlefield. Vehicles wedged, mud everywhere, fat bodies slipping and flailing, megaphone shrieks echoing across the property, and Derek and I recording every cinematic angle, already envisioning the montage that would make last night's spectacle look tame by comparison. Sheriff Cole arriving with his usual calm demeanor, but even he paused for a moment, surveying the chaos, mud-covered SUVs, flailing fat bodies, and shouted threats, before shaking his head and sighing, clearly recognizing that this was beyond petty HOA mischief and into the realm of theatrical disaster. Claire, soaked in mud, fat limbs wobbling, shouted for immediate extraction, claiming legal rights she didn't possess, while tow operators, shaking their heads, began the delicate and excruciating process of extracting vehicles without triggering a collapse into the trenches. Every movement, every word, every flail of fat desperation was captured perfectly on camera, each shot more glorious than the last, creating a cinematic tableau of chaos, hubris, and inevitable downfall. By afternoon, the last SUV had been stabilized, Claire perched precariously on the edge of a trench, pink windbreaker plastered, hair a mud-soaked mess, latte long evaporated into a brown puddle, and the rest of her entourage looked defeated, exhausted, and humiliated, while Derek and I allowed ourselves a slow, satisfied smile, knowing this section of the war had been won in spectacular fashion. Yet, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the fields and mud traps, I knew this victory would only fuel her fat, entitled rage further, that her plans would escalate, and that my farm, my trenches, and my strategy would need to be more clever, more cinematic, and more ruthless than ever before, because Claire Phillips did not quit, did not accept defeat, and would return with a vengeance that only a truly dramatic saga could contain, setting the stage for the next chapter in this epic battle of land, law, and the absurdity of entitlement in the face of meticulous, poetic, and cinematic retribution. The morning after the mud siege, the farm seemed deceptively quiet, the soft chirping of birds and rustling of leaves betraying none of the chaos from the previous day, but Derek and I knew better. This calm was the breath before the storm, the deceptive lull before Claire Phillips, the fat, entitled HOA president, returned for her next theatrical attempt at domination. I spent hours walking the perimeter, checking each trap, measuring the depth of each trench, and reinforcing every muddy patch. Because we both knew that she would adapt. An adaptation for a fat, reckless Karen meant bringing more vehicles, more muscle, and a dramatic flair that could only be matched by equally meticulous preparation. By noon, distant engines announced her return, a convoy of SUVs, vans, and even a rented flatbed truck, with pink windbreakers glinting in the sun like a parade of oblivious arrogance, and at the forefront, Claire perched on the roof of her largest SUV, megaphone in hand, fat arms waving wildly, yelling about rights she didn't have, property she never owned, and punishments she would unleash on anyone daring to oppose her, oblivious to the cinematic irony of her floundering form against the unforgiving terrain. Derek and I watched from the barn loft, binoculars trained on every approaching vehicle, my notebook already filled with sketches, measurements, and contingency plans for every possible failure scenario. The farm had become a living maze of engineered disasters. Deepened trenches, reinforced mud pits, hidden stakes, strategically collapsed fences, and even small, subtle ditches designed to direct traffic into the most cinematic points of humiliation, ensuring that every inch of her fat, entitled parade would be recorded in slow-motion glory. The first SUV tried to cross a newly reinforced trench, wheels spinning helplessly, mud spraying like a volcanic eruption, fat tires sinking, suspension groaning under the strain, and Claire's voice erupted from the megaphone, shrill and high-pitched, demanding action from the rest of her entourage while inadvertently turning her own struggle into an absurd performance art piece. Derek chuckled behind me, already envisioning the montage that would make last week's disaster look like a mere prelude, and I nodded, my mind already calculating the additional reinforcements needed for the next wave. One van skidded sideways into a cleverly positioned mud trap, wedging itself firmly in place, while another SUV, attempting to avoid the quagmire, hit a hidden wooden beam that tipped it onto the edge of the trench, sending Claire wobbling dangerously, fat limbs flailing, and megaphone clattering into the mud. Her entourage screamed, attempted to stabilize the vehicles, but every move only worsened the disaster, a domino effect perfectly engineered by my meticulous planning and her own reckless confidence. By early afternoon the chaos had reached its peak. Trucks stranded, vans sliding uncontrollably, fat bodies slipping and falling, megaphone shrieks echoing across the property, and Derek and I capturing every cinematic angle with precision, every slow-motion disaster frame more glorious than the last. Sheriff Cole arrived once more, eyes wide at the spectacle, mud-covered SUVs, flailing fat bodies, megaphones lost in the quagmire, and even he had to shake his head in disbelief, muttering about the absurdity of HOA politics intersecting with farm engineering. Claire, soaked in mud, pink windbreaker unrecognizable, hair plastered, fat arms trembling, continued shouting threats, lawyers, and social media warnings, but every word was swallowed by the chaos she had walked into, a perfect storm of her own hubris. The fat, entitled president attempted a final dramatic gesture, climbing atop the largest SUV, mud caking her entire frame, and yelling that she would not be defeated, that I would regret this, and that the HOA would take action, all while the vehicle slowly sank into the treacherous trench I had engineered, tilting dangerously as her screams mixed with the groaning of metal and the squelch of mud. Derek and I watched in gleeful horror as her entourage attempted to rescue her, only to trigger additional collapses. One van slid backward into a hidden ditch, toppling over, while another SUV's wheels found the softest mud patches and sank almost to the axles, leaving fat bodies dangling, slipping and flailing, every movement perfectly choreographed by the unpredictable laws of gravity and terrain, and yet fully anticipated by our meticulous planning. By late afternoon, the last vehicle had been stabilized, Claire perched precariously on a collapsing SUV, mud dripping from every fold of her fat body, pink windbreaker shredded, hair plastered and unrecognizable, her megaphone lost in the mud puddle below, and the rest of her entourage looked exhausted, defeated, and humiliated, while Derek and I allowed ourselves a slow, satisfied smile, knowing we had reached a new pinnacle of cinematic retribution. But even in this moment of victory, the farm seemed to hum with anticipation, the shadows lengthening, the earth whispering possibilities of further chaos, because one thing was certain. Claire Phillips, fat, entitled, and utterly convinced of her supremacy, would not rest, would not accept defeat, and would return with even more vehicles, more schemes, and more absurd theatrics, ensuring that the saga of mud, trenches, and cinematic humiliation would continue, escalating beyond anything the small, entitled HOA could imagine, and guaranteeing that every inch of the farm, every trap, every strategic disaster, would become part of a living, breathing masterpiece of poetic revenge, a tale told in mud, sweat, and the fat, flailing form of an HOA president who had finally met her match. The sun barely peeked over the horizon, painting the farm in a golden glow that belied the absolute chaos about to unfold. Derek and I had been awake for hours, reviewing every mud trap, every trench, every pitfall, anticipating Karen Phillips' fat, entitled return, and somehow the tension felt even thicker than the mud that had claimed her SUVs last week. Our cameras were lined up, drones charged, and every possible angle plotted to capture the final act of what had become the most cinematic confrontation in HOA history. By mid-morning, the distant roar of engines announced her approach, a fleet of vehicles larger than ever before, some clearly rented for the occasion, all emblazoned with pink accents and ridiculous HOA slogans, and at the helm, as always, Fat Karen, megaphone in one hand, clipboard in the other, her pink windbreaker stretched over her enormous frame, hair plastered, sunglasses reflecting the sun with a smug confidence that had survived multiple mud disasters. Derek whispered, "She's bringing everything this time," and I nodded grimly, knowing that the entire farm had become a chessboard of strategic humiliation, each trap more elaborate than the last, each mud pit deeper, each slope calculated to perfection to ensure maximum chaos. The first SUV tried to cross the reinforced trenches we had perfected, tires spinning, fat doors slamming as Karen yelled through the megaphone, but this time she was met with the full spectacle. Hidden beams collapsed under the weight, mud erupted like geysers, and the vehicle tilted, sending her sprawling into the cab, fat limbs flailing, while Derek and I captured every agonized moment. One by one, her fleet of vehicles met disaster. Vans slid into hidden ditches, fat bodies bouncing helplessly on collapsing wood panels, SUVs wedged into mud pits that deepened with every desperate maneuver, and every attempt to stabilize the vehicles only triggered new collapses, creating a symphony of metallic groans, squelching mud, and Karen's shrill, indecipherable megaphone threats. By noon, the chaos had reached cinematic perfection. Fat Karen clinging to a truck roof, pink windbreaker torn, mud dripping from every fold of her enormous body, while Derek and I maneuvered drones to capture slow-motion angles of vehicles sinking, sliding, and flipping, ensuring that the visual narrative of her defeat would be undeniable, viral in every way possible. The neighbors had begun to gather at the edges of the farm, some recording secretly, some gaping in awe as they witnessed the fat, entitled president of the HOA reduced to a living cartoon of her own hubris. Lawyers called frantically, sirens sounded in the distance, but nothing could stop the spectacle we had orchestrated, the culmination of weeks of strategic engineering and the poetic justice of mud, trenches, and terrain mastery. Karen, realizing the disaster was unstoppable, attempted her last dramatic gesture, climbing to the highest point of a tipping SUV, shouting that she would be remembered, that the HOA would rise again, that I would regret everything. But gravity and mud had their own verdict. The vehicle lurched violently, Fat Karen teetered precariously, then slid in slow motion into the mud pit below, landing with a thunderous splash that sent mud flying for feet in every direction, while her megaphone floated beside her like a defeated flag of surrender. Derek and I rushed to the edge of the farm, adrenaline surging, capturing the aftermath. Fat Karen, utterly humiliated, stuck in a trench, her entourage frantically trying to extract her, lawyers shouting into phones, sirens approaching, and every inch of her carefully curated image of authority obliterated by the relentless farm and its mud traps. By late afternoon, the vehicles had been removed, but the story was clear. The HOA, led by Fat Karen Phillips, had been decisively defeated, not through lawsuits, not through intimidation, but through the simple, poetic engineering of nature and strategy, a masterclass of farm defense, mud manipulation, and cinematic retribution. Derek and I stood surveying the property, the sun casting long shadows over the trenches, mud pits, and collapsed vehicles, knowing this moment would be remembered, shared, and laughed at for years, a testament to ingenuity, patience, and the absolute futility of entitlement when faced with meticulous planning. As the sirens faded into the distance and neighbors reluctantly departed, whispers of the farm's triumph began to circulate, videos uploaded, social media buzzing, and Karen's pink windbreaker became a symbol of failure, of fat, entitled arrogance crushed beneath mud and gravity. I allowed myself a slow breath, feeling the satisfaction of a 7-section saga completed, the farm secure, and the ultimate lesson delivered. You may think you own the world, but sometimes the world, and a well-engineered trench, owns you. And as the last light of day shimmered across the muddy battlefield, I knew one thing with perfect clarity. The saga of Fat Karen and the relentless HOA chaos had ended, and nothing, not even entitlement, could ever rise from that mud again. Theatrics, and I couldn't help but note the beauty and the precision of it all. The way the trench had claimed its victim exactly as intended, every inch a testament to planning and patience. Her phone flew across the floor, her yoga mat tangled under the wheels, and she stumbled out of the SUV, hair wild, face red and shiny with sweat, clutching at her oversized sunglasses, screaming into the phone, demanding immediate assistance, legal action, criminal charges, and divine intervention all at once. Derek whispered, "You think the sheriff's going to believe this is a mere accident?" I shook my head with a grin, watching as Claire stomped the mud with her oversized boots, the dirt clinging to her windbreaker, making her look even more absurd, her massive form wobbling like a top-heavy statue of entitlement. Within minutes, a sheriff's cruiser appeared, lights flashing faintly against the backdrop of rolling hills, Sheriff Cole Matthews stepping out, tall, seasoned, with an expression that had clearly seen too many petty HOA disputes to be impressed. Claire launched into her tirade instantly, pointing fingers, waving her phone, the words flying out of her mouth in a torrent of hysteria. "This is sabotage. A trap. You endangered my life," she screamed, and I had to suppress a laugh, watching her struggle to balance herself on the muddy incline, latte-soaked, windbreaker-smeared, ego in tatters. Cole raised an eyebrow, calm and deliberate, and gestured toward the trench. "Care to explain, Mr. Rogers?" he asked, tone slow, measured, seasoned with authority. I pointed, letting my hand linger over the neatly carved edges of the trench, and began explaining the situation, detailing months of repeated trespassing, destroyed signage, and blatant arrogance. Claire's mouth moved, forming words that probably would have made sense to someone fluent in entitlement, but to Cole, it was all background noise. I handed him the laminated county map, the deeds, all meticulously prepared, each red boundary line and arrow pointing straight to the truth. The road, the land, the authority, they were mine, all mine, untouched and indisputable. Cole traced the lines slowly, his face neutral, and then looked at Claire, who was now hopping from foot to foot, large hands flailing, windbreaker smeared with mud, sunglasses crooked, and pink streaks of latte on her oversized cheeks. "This is Roger's land," Cole said quietly but firmly. "You have no legal access, and until a lawful easement is granted, you are trespassing." Her jaw dropped so hard I thought I could hear it echo in the valley. She sputtered, waving her phone like a conductor, calling lawyers, environmental inspectors, anyone she could summon from the depths of Whispering Pines, but Cole's patience was infinite, his calm unshakable, and every shout of hers only emphasized her lack of authority, her massive frame now comically overshadowed by the sheer reality of her defeat. Derek nudged me, whispering, "I can't believe she actually thinks she owns the world." I nodded, grinning, watching as Claire attempted to reverse her SUV out of the trench, wheels spinning helplessly, mud flinging in dramatic arcs across her pink windbreaker, her face a portrait of panic, humiliation, and disbelief, every movement exaggerated by the sheer absurdity of her oversized self struggling against physics and karma. The tow trucks arrived, chains rattling, cranes swinging, men muttering under their breath, attempting to wrest the vehicle from the earth, while Claire barked orders, pacing, pointing, gesturing like a general commanding a war she had already lost. Every time the rig strained, the SUV groaned like it knew it had become the unwilling star of a cautionary tale. Mud splattered across her face, latte dripping from the dashboard, hair stuck to her sweat-drenched cheeks, and I had to admit to myself a quiet satisfaction that no amount of money, influence, or HOA paperwork could save her from the consequences of sheer arrogance. Cameras hidden in the brush captured every angle, the sun climbing higher, spotlighting the disaster, and I imagined the eventual video montage. Claire Phillips, fat, flailing, screaming, trapped by a trench meticulously dug over days, a symbol of entitlement meeting precision and patience. The scene unfolded like a dark comedy. Tow operators shouting, chains snapping, cranes lifting and jerking, mud flying, Claire screaming, Derek doubled over laughing, Boomer barking in encouragement, Sheriff Cole observing with an expression that oscillated between disbelief and amusement, and me calm, coffee in hand, soaking in the poetic symmetry of justice at work. Hours passed in a blur of chaos, Claire escalating, shouting, calling everyone from the HOA to environmental agencies, her massive form increasingly covered in mud, sweat, and despair, and by the time the sun began its descent, the SUV remained partially submerged, a monument to patience and planning. Claire's ego diminished to match the mud-caked reality, and I leaned against the fence, taking a long, deep breath of satisfaction. The mail brought further declarations, laminated threats, fines, environmental notices, every attempt to intimidate countered with deeds, maps, and evidence of her trespass, and each letter only fueled the fire of my resolve, planning further subtle lessons, reinforcing boundaries, documenting every move, knowing that the next day would bring more absurdities from Claire and her army of paper pushers, but now armed with truth and law on my side. I watched the sun dip behind the ridge, the trench gleaming faintly, a perfect scar in the earth, symbolic of principle, and I knew that this wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a series of events that would see entitlement collide with reality, arrogance humbled, and the natural order restored, one muddy, dramatic, cinematic moment at a time, with cameras rolling, evidence gathered, and every inch of that land standing firm, mine, untouchable, and a silent declaration to the world that no HOA, no fat Karen, no laminated letter, and no SUV could ever rewrite the story of hard work, persistence, and justice carved into the soil itself. The next morning, the smell of coffee again woke me before the sun, the distant roar of vehicles signaled more action, and I leaned against the porch rail, watching Claire attempt to organize another rescue, fat form wobbling, windbreaker stained, latte now cold, shouting into her phone while Derek whispered, "She really doesn't know when to quit," and I smiled, knowing that patience, precision, and preparation had transformed my land into a stage of poetic justice, and every moment of this cinematic battle, trench, SUV, mud, coffee, camera, and colossal entitlement, would be remembered as a perfect, chaotic, righteous triumph of principle over audacity.